In 1949, Viktor Frankl accepted an invitation to lecture in Germany. He had been out of the camps for 4 years. His wife, his mother, his father, his brother, all murdered by the Germans. He had every reason to refuse the invitation. He had every reason to refuse to set foot in the country whose institutions had organized the murder of his family. He went. This decision was not theatrical. He did not announce it as forgiveness or as a grand gesture of reconciliation. He simply accepted the invitation, prepared his lecture, and went. He gave the lecture. He gave more lectures in the following years. He returned again and again to Germany over the next 5 decades, eventually receiving honorary doctorates from German universities and forming working relationships with German psychiatrists who became some of his most important collaborators. What he did in 1949 may have been his most courageous public act. The courage was not in standing up to enemies. The courage was in choosing not to be defined by what enemies had done to him. He had survived. He could have spent the rest of his life as a survivor, meaning as a person whose identity was organized around the wrong that had been done. He chose, instead, to be a psychiatrist who had survived. The order of those 2 words mattered to him. The survival was a fact about his past. The psychiatry was the work that still lay ahead. Other survivors made different choices. Some refused ever to return to Germany. Some refused to speak the German language. Some refused to do business with German institutions. None of these refusals were wrong. Frankl never criticized them. He recognized that each survivor had to find their own way of carrying what had happened. His way was not better than theirs. His way was the way that allowed him to keep doing his work. But his way required a particular kind of refusal that was the inverse of theirs. He refused to let the camp determine his future relationship with a whole nation. He had developed, in his philosophical work, the principle that collective guilt was not a real category. Guilt, in his view, was always personal. There were no guilty peoples. There were guilty persons, and there were innocent persons, and the two could not be sorted by nationality. Some of his Auschwitz guards had been Austrian, like him. Some of his rescuers had been German. To assign moral status by passport was to repeat, in inverted form, the racial thinking that had built the camps. This conviction had cost him before. Some Jewish colleagues thought him naive. Some thought he was minimizing the horror. He did not think he was doing either. He thought he was refusing to let the horror corrupt his judgment about how to treat individuals. The collective category had killed his family. He would not adopt the collective category against others. The price of refusing to was that he had to treat each German he met as a person, evaluable only by what they personally did, with no presumption of guilt by association. So in 1949 he went to Germany. He spoke to audiences that contained Germans who had been adults during the Nazi period. Some had been complicit. Some had not. Most had at least known and had done nothing. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not soften the content of his lecture to spare them. He spoke about meaning, about responsibility, about the freedom that even the worst circumstances do not extinguish. The Germans in the audience knew who he was. They knew where he had been. They knew, in many cases, what their own families had been doing while he had been in Auschwitz. He looked at them and spoke about responsibility before life. He did not accuse them. He gave them, by his presence, the dignity of being addressed as moral agents who could still choose. From there, he assumed, they would have to do their own work. This had a peculiar effect. Many Germans found his lectures more powerful than the explicit accusations they had been receiving from other quarters. Frankl was not telling them they were monsters. He was treating them as persons capable of responsibility. That treatment, coming from a survivor, was harder to dismiss than denunciation. They could not respond to it with defensiveness. There was nothing to defend against. Frankl was simply being a serious psychiatrist talking about serious things. They had to either join the conversation as serious persons or expose themselves as not yet capable of it. Most chose to join. Over the following decades, Frankl's relationship with Germany deepened. He worked closely with German colleagues. He helped train a generation of German psychiatrists. He saw his books become standard texts in German universities. He never forgot what had been done. He simply refused to let what had been done dictate the limits of what could now be built. He told a story about an encounter that captured what he was doing. A young German psychiatrist came to him after a lecture in Munich. The young man said, "Dr. Frankl, why do you come here? Why do you sit with us?" Frankl looked at him and said, "Because you are not your fathers. Because the work I do has to do with the people in front of me, not with the people behind them. Because the past, even at its worst, does not have authority over what we build next. The young psychiatrist remembered the words for the rest of his life. He became one of Frankl's important German interlocutors. This was Frankl's courage. It was not the courage of confrontation. It was the courage of presence. He went to the place that had every reason to be poison for him, and he refused to let the poison spread into his next move. He carried the grief. He did not let the grief eat his future. The grief had taken his family. He would not let the grief also take his ability to do his work in the country where his work was needed. He thought this kind of refusal had wide application. Other people, in smaller versions, faced the same question. A divorce, a betrayal, a workplace injury, a community that had failed them. The temptation was always to wall off the source of injury and never engage with it again. Sometimes that was right. Sometimes, however, the cost of the wall was higher than the cost of careful re-engagement. The wall preserved the injury intact at the center of one's life. Re-engagement risked further hurt but allowed the injury to take its proper place as one thing among many. Frankl never told other survivors to do what he had done. He recognized the choice was personal. He only said, when asked, that his own peace had come from a stance toward Germany that some had found surprising. He had refused to be a permanent enemy of a country that had killed his family. He had let the enmity have its day, and then he had let it end. What had replaced it was not friendship in any simple sense. It was working relationship, mutual professional respect, the slow building of something that the past had tried to prevent. This is what he taught, in lectures and in conversations, for the next 50 years. The past is the past. The past is permanent. The past is what was. The future is what you build now, with the materials at hand, including the people in front of you, even when those people belong to a category that has hurt you. To refuse them entirely is to let the past keep killing what could otherwise grow. To meet them as persons is to risk the further hurt of disappointment. The risk, Frankl thought, was worth taking. He had taken it in 1949. He took it again every year that followed. The result was a life that had not been confined to its worst chapter. That, in the end, was the proof that the camp had failed.